So welcome everyone to tonight's event, which is another in our series of the ODI in Conversation. And welcome to everyone in the room and also to everybody online. For those who would like to tweet, by the way, we also have some tweeting going on hashtag Africa Prospects, which you can see here on the screen. Carlos and I have already been tweeting this evening along with Kevin, so please do tweet as we go through the event. To introduce myself, I'm Dr. Judith Tyson, and I'm part of the Economic Development Group here at the ODI. So tonight's topic, of course, is absolutely the heart of our research interests, which is around the prospects for Africa today, especially given the economic slowdown that we've seen in the last 18 months in the continent, but of course, I think today in the context of the uncertainty around Brexit as well. But our group is interested in, of course, short-term prospects, but also longer-term issues around structural change in Africa. So that includes things like the diversification of the economy, employment creation, and of course, heart of the ODI's concerns, poverty alleviation. We're very pleased to welcome to the ODI tonight Dr. Carlos Lopes, who is from the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and David, who is the Africa editor of the Financial Times. David is one of the leading journalists at the FT. He's very experienced. He's been at the FT since 1990, I believe, in a number of roles. That includes as foreign correspondent, senior editor, and Asia editor. And those of you who know his work, which I'm quite a fan, I like to read it. Of course, he covers economics and business, but I think it would also be fair to say with quite a strong political bent to some of the work that he likes to write about. So it's, of course, very relevant to the African context. Carlos is the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, an organisation that's very well known to us at the ODI, of course, for its expertise, but also some of the joint work that we've done, including quite a number of papers we've written in the last 18 months on various topics of interest. Carlos has also previously served as UN Undersecretary, the Executive Director of the UN Institute for Training and Research, the UN Assistant Secretary General, and the UN Director for Political Affairs, as well as senior positions at the UNDP and in the public sector in his native Guinea-Bissau. So David and Carlos, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thanks very much, Carlos, for joining us. And this is meant to be a conversation, except I've only just really started covering Africa, so I hope it's going to be more of a monologue. And I'm just going to prod you with a few simple questions. So we're here to talk about Africa, but I don't think anyone here would forgive me, and I wouldn't forgive myself, if we didn't start with Brexit. We're used to, in a sense, looking at Africa and kind of, criticising and seeing difficulties, but from an African point of view, here you are looking at this British-made shambles. First of all, I kind of wonder what you just make of what Britain's just done, and also the obvious question really is what the impact of this may be on Africa.
Well, let me start with the soft impact, or the soft sides of the impact. Over the last 2 decades, we have been very busy in Africa putting together the African Union, which is a replacement of the Organization of African Unity. And the proclamation of the African Union was with the objective of being a bit more efficient, making sure that the institutions were of a new generation, more modern, more contemporary. And the model was the European Union. So I can see a lot of people in Addis a bit perplexed with developments here. And obviously, it's something that really is going to be the subject of a lot of discussions, particularly this year because we have transition of leadership in the African Union. So this comes at a time where there was also a certain degree of uncertainty in Africa itself. So they are going to look into these developments with great interest.
Can we send you Boris?
Well, we have a lot of Boris on our own. The second soft impact of this development is actually about regionalism. Because there's a lot of discussions right now taking place, even at the UN, about the role of regionalism. And what is happening in Europe is going to question some truths that were admitted as almost a given. And I can see that is going to be a major subject of concern. But I prefer to concentrate on the economic impact of Brexit in Africa. And there are some facts that are important to signal before I give you my reading of the impacts. First is that Britain is not that much of a powerhouse in the trade statistics in the continent. You know, right now it represents about 5% of our trade. In terms of investment also, the stock of FDI from UK is around 8%. So just to put things into a macro perspective, it's not like everything is going to be in shambles. There are a number of countries that have much more closer relations with Britain that are going to suffer the consequences of, market access and a number of difficulties that may arise from Brexit. Where I see the real importance of Brexit for Africa, and it's very negative, is around the role that the UK represents in the world economy, and particularly in the financial sector, because most of the innovative, original financial vehicles, particularly private equity related, that have been put together over the last 10, 15 years, dedicated to Africa. And for a long time, Africa didn't have proper financial vehicles with interest in, say, more risk type of investment. They were developed here in London. And I can see that the London city is going to be completely obsessed for the next, say, 24 months, trying to figure out so many aspects of the Brexit that the appetite for these very marginal portfolios relating to Africa is not going to be really very high on the agenda. We can see that some of the requirements that have been agreed as part of a change in the regulations of the financial sector, like for instance, the ratios that are required from the banks as a result of the Basel II negotiations, were already asking the banks, the big banks, to get rid of their African assets. This is happening in a number of countries, and here, Barclays is the most important example. And I can see an acceleration of that phenomena as a result of less risk exposure, and we're going to get rid of the African assets. So that is going to be obviously the first port of call for a number of very important managerial decisions that have to be taken by big banks. The third important consequence is that we have been busy over the last year negotiating the economic partnership agreements with Europe, and of course UK was part of it. Now, what is going to happen to those economic partnership agreements? Do they include UK or not? If they don't include UK, are we going to be busy negotiating other agreements with UK? Is the ratification of these agreements by African countries in particular going to be as smooth as it was when they see that Europe is sort of in a state of disarray? So that is going to be major. And finally, I think currency volatility. We already were experiencing in a number of African currencies incredible pressure resulting from a number of macro developments. And this just adds to the difficult decisions that Africans have to make. I'll give you an example. In South Africa, which is one of the countries that has had one of the highest depreciations of the local currency, the rand, I can see very easily the consequences of the dollar becoming more strengthened with the Brexit, and then the lack of growth in South Africa, making it very tempting for most of the local listed companies to try to expatriate as much as they can. So we have an ambiance that was already not very conducive for investment. Africa was already being penalized by lack of appetite, and this is just going to make it much worse.
Right. Which takes us on to the whole Africa Rising narrative. I've been doing this job 6 months. The African Rising narrative, in a sense, was over by the time I took over the job. But it's kind of maybe useful to look back a little bit on that. Clearly there was some hype and some exaggeration. But now that the commodity boom has burst, now that China's slowed down, and maybe losing a little bit of interest in Africa, although I'm not quite sure about that. What is left of the Africa Rising narrative, do you think?
Well, the Africa Rising narrative has never been a story constructed by the Africans themselves. It was mostly the creation of important consulting firms like McKinsey and Ernst & Young in particular. And they stick to their guns. They continue, they just release new reports. They continue to say it's sustainable. And what we are experiencing is basically an inflection that is provoked by the macro tendencies in the world, and not necessarily that the fundamentals of Africa have changed. And I do believe there is some truth in this story. But what is more important is to say that the Africans themselves have constructed a different narrative that was much more based on the need for structural transformation, which, in the context of Africa can be put forward in basically three elements. We need to increase agricultural productivity because agricultural productivity is the best solution for poverty reduction in the continent, because the majority of the population continues to depend on the primary sector, and the primary sector contribution to GDP is going down for now 3 decades. Last 2 years it has increased a bit, but it's about 16% of Africa's GDP, when it still comprehends between 60 and 70% of labor. The second is industrialization, and then the third is making sure that the services boom is going to contribute to modernizing the economy and are not going to be basically boosted through informal sector type of activities. How do you make all this transformation happen? Depends in a great deal. This is our take, but now it's not just the take of the Economic Commission for Africa, it's the take of most African institutions, including endorsed by the African heads of state, is to say that we need industrial policy. And industrial policy is not just about manufacturing. It's about having a comprehensiveness and an interventionist state that makes what it takes, like in Asia it happened, for growth to get to a certain level, and engages the private sector also in a certain sort of dynamic way.
Can I pick you up on that?
Yes. Yes.
I would like to pick up on various things that you've said, but let's start with industrial policy. And I'm very interested in this, having come from Asia and having seen the successes of, first Japan, then Taiwan, then Korea, China latterly. And the countries that have been very successful have done things that are, in a sense, opposite to the Washington Consensus.
Correct.
They've been protectionist to a certain extent. They've picked winners. They've suppressed their financial systems by suppressing interest rates and churning out money to favoured industries. A lot of it started with agriculture, which I'll come on to. Africa is seen to have tried this and failed in before the structural adjustment programs. And perhaps some people, even people who are sympathetic to what Asia did, people may say, well, it's too late now. It's too late because of technological advance. It's too late because of the WTO and some of the rules, and you simply could not do what, say, South Korea did, because that would just be illegal, internationally now. What does industrial policy? The other thing is that some African countries are very small. And size generally helps in these things. What does good industrial policy look like in an African state these days? Well,
I'm glad you mentioned, the latecomer sort of status of industrialization in Africa, because that's where, we really need a much more sophisticated approach. It is true that intellectual property regimes have become extremely complex. Africa has no competence in the field, and that is very much required for you to absorb some of the technological developments. Value chains have become very complex. There is nothing that is produced from A to Z in the same place.
Yeah.
You need, to include in your value chains even elements that didn't exist when others industrialized. Like, for instance, the importance of branding and marketing and all that. The fact that we have trade regimes that are extremely sophisticated and impede most of crude protectionist practices that others have used very effectively to industrialize. The fact that we don't have access to capital the same way as in Asia, they did because they had savings that we don't possess.
From agriculture at first, but anyway, we'll go on to that.
That they don't possess. And then we can go on with the list. And all of that is true, which means that Africa has a very, very narrow window to practice good industrial policy, but it does have some elements in its favor. So I will just mention 4 that are probably the most important. The first one is the fact that we are going to make industrialization at a time where the costs of energy from renewables matches the cost of fossil fuels, which means that we can immediately leapfrog into green industrialization. Others have to retrofit. That is very expensive. It's very complex on its own. So our interest in technology should focus mostly in frugal innovation and also taking advantage of renewable energy as the propeller of a certain type of industrialization. So that's one advantage that others don't have. And of course, you can add to that the fact that we have one of the largest potential in the world in terms of renewable energy in all categories. The second element is that it's the labor force in the world is going to change. The demographic dynamics are the ones we know. They are going to affect China now big time. About 85 million jobs have to get out of the manufacturing sector in China in the next 10 years.
This is Helen Hai's number.
Yeah. Well, that is the number of Justin Lin, former chief economist of the World Bank and now Tsinghua University professor and a passionate of Africa. And he says that about 1/3 of those jobs can come to Africa. Which ones? The low value type of jobs. So it's not about producing very sophisticated goods, but maybe starting with the low end of the scale. And the reason why this is very attractive is not because we are going to replicate the export model of Asia, but because, and this is the third factor, African market is going to be very attractive. So it's going to be 2 billion people. By 2050, it is going to be 1.3 billion people in cities. So it's the fastest urbanization in history. And of course, we are already seeing the trends. All reports say that in terms of consumer market attractiveness, Africa is very well positioned. It's just behind emerging Asia. And right now, when you look into greenfield investments in the continent, they are all going into services more than people think are going into minerals and extractives. Not at all. They have become much more focused on services because of this potential that the consumer market is offering. So that is an element that is crucial for us to bear in mind, particularly because it creates the opportunities for the agricultural transformation that Africa has lacked so far. Because we can go into agribusiness, because Africa imports 83% of its processed food. There is no reason why you cannot really start your industrialization with 3 entry points. One is agrobusiness, including small and medium scale. Second is value addition of your minerals and extractives, natural resources in general. But we should not be too ambitious on that. I think we have now about 15% value addition on natural resources in Africa. If I say go to 25%, we should be lucky. That means about 7 to 10 million jobs additional per year. And then the third entry point is to import from Asia the low-end production. So it is a very small window.
Yeah.
And of course, this window also will not be feasible, and this is my last element, without regional integration. We have to create a single market in the continent. And this is a very important discussion that is taking place right now.
Again, there's various things I want to pick you up on there. And by the way, I will be opening up for questions shortly, so if you can think of some questions. One is what you said about services. I mean, I've been writing about the economy for 25 years, and I still really have no idea how it works, which puts me in good company with most economists, I think. I mean, I don't quite understand how lots of poor people coming from the countryside to big cities and not making anything, and servicing each other, cutting each other's hair, selling each other insurance, how that becomes a market. Do you not need to create wealth first before you can spend it, or is this just hopelessly simplistic?
No, I mean, look, people think that growth in Africa, of course, you have to take out as a parenthesis the last 2 years because they have not been as good as before. Although, I must just for the record state that, in terms of a number of indicators, we are right now, 2016, at levels that are much better than before 2008, which was some of the best years of Africa's growth. So it's not as bad as it looks. But this being said, it's not coming from extractive industries. It's not coming from exports of natural resources, although that is very important for the income of governments. That's not what is propelling Africa's growth. Africa's growth, 2/3 is coming from internal consumption. And right now, GDP of the continent as a whole, 41% is coming from services. So somehow people are actually consuming. And one good example is actually cell phones. The penetration in Africa now is 80%, and the penetration of internet is about 24 to 30%. But in just a few years, according to Cisco and all these different institutions doing empirical research, but also projections on mobile telephony, this is going to be the fastest growing market already. It is the case, but also leapfrogging in a number of areas other markets. Like, for instance, the use of cloud computing. Use of cloud computing is going to be much faster in Africa than it is in other parts of the world. Mobile banking, of course, it's already a sort of a case study.
Sure. But I was surprised to see, for example, how much that's taken on with Tanzania. One often hears about Kenya, obviously, but Tanzania is $2.5 billion go over the mobile networks every month.
And now, what is fascinating is the number of people that have more than one cell phone.
Yeah.
One cell phone is already, quite an achievement. But they have more than one cell phone and still don't have latrines.
Yeah. This is what Narendra Modi said in India, of course. Yeah. There are more cell phones in India than toilets.
Yes.
Yeah. Power. So you mentioned renewable power. I don't see how you can industrialize without power, and Africa has been absolutely hopeless.
Yes.
Nigeria, a country swimming in oil and gas, can't put the lights on. Why not?
Well, in 2010, we were investing about $68 billion of different sources in energy infrastructure projects. We are now at 90 billion. So it's growing.
Yeah.
Of course, it's still not catching up with a huge deficit. But, some countries are really going to turn the corner very quickly. One of them is Ethiopia. With their Grand Renaissance Dam, they are going to be able to export energy, not just have complete coverage of the country, but also export. And there are a number of countries now that have in their sort of plan to become exporters of energy to neighboring countries. I think if we get it right, by basically using the example of mobile telephony, and we liberalize distribution and production of power, we are going to see a revolution in Africa in terms of power.
Yeah.
Capabilities.
Why the reluctance to do that? I mean, I'm struck. I was in Nigeria.
We are in the middle of that discussion. A few countries are about to take the big decision, the big plunge, and they actually are countries that will make a difference. One of them is Nigeria.
Yeah.
And if that happens in those big markets, then you have a turnaround.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with mobile telephony. And then, you will have just an explosion of projects.
Right.
Because it becomes really attractive.
Because what governments tend to say to you is, power is a right of everybody, so we must, ensure that there's cheap power, so cheap that, of course, it's in nobody's interest to manufacture it, because you lose money for every watt you sell. So nobody has it. So how do you get out of that political bind?
Here we go back to the interventionist state. Interventionist state is not about having a Soviet economy. It's about being very smart. It's about being a smart state, investing on a number of very important enablers that are going to make industrialization possible and transformation of the economy possible. You have a group of countries that are real reformers right now. About 22 countries in Africa are above emerging markets average growth. And if you look into why you have so many, it's basically because you have a reform mentality that was not there before. What is penalizing Africa really right now, more than anything is penalizing the Africa Rising story, is the fact that the three biggest economies of the continent are doing very badly.
Yeah.
If you take South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria out of the equation, we are doing excellent.
Right.
The problem is these three
Yeah.
are really dragging the entire, average down.
Right. I'm seeing Pravin Gordon tomorrow. Thursday. I'll tell him you said that.
You can. Well, he's trying his best, but it's not easy. And if they have zero growth, it's an
Sure.
achievement.
Yeah, they're growing slower than Japan.
Yes.
South Africa.
They will have an achievement if they have zero growth.
Yes, absolutely. My final question, just before I turn it over to the audience, agriculture. I was in the WEF, the World Economic Forum in Kigali, and Klaus Schwab was there talking about the third or fourth, or was it fifth? Fifth industrial
fourth
revolution.
industrial
the fourth,
revolution.
That's right. Yes.
I hate that.
Yeah, me too. My, my reaction was, well, we haven't had the green revolution yet. In Tanzania, where I was last week, the economy has been growing at 7% a year for 15 years, if you believe the statistics. Dar es Salaam has maybe been growing at 20% a year. Agriculture, where 70% of people live 3% a year, which is basically, that's just more people. I mean, that's just population growth. Why has a country like Tanzania not been able to do better?
Well, McKinsey is going to publish their Lions on the Move version 2.0 in 1 month or
God,
so.
that sounds awful.
I hate lions because they are not gender sensitive and they are lazy. But what they are saying there is basically that, in terms of jobs growth in the continent, we are doing very well. That's their conclusion, after, plunging through a lot of data. They come to this very spectacular finding, insight, that if you look into the growth of the labor force and population, population age, it's about 2.8%, and jobs growth in Africa is about 2.9% a year. So we are slightly above in terms of creating jobs in relation to the intake into the overall labor market. It's coming from services, it's coming from manufacturing, surprisingly, but not from agriculture.
No, but it shouldn't come from agriculture. Actually, I mean, if you improve productivity, then
yes
that
and no,
releases
because
workers to...
yes, but you can because these are formal jobs. You can have more formal jobs in agriculture.
Sure. Yes.
And that's we are not having.
I see.
So it's sort of not just a poor performer in terms of productivity.
Right.
Yields per hectare are the lowest in the world and all that, but it's also a poor performer in terms of using natural resources. We are using them in a way that is completely incapable of taking into account technological developments, but also green opportunities.
Yes.
So why is this? Well, I have a theory. My theory is that, for the last 30 years, I have done a bit of the calculations. Year after year, ODA has thrown about $10 billion into the primary sector in Africa. Year after year, $10 billion. And they have not been able to achieve any growth in terms of productivity and yields per hectare. Why? Because we have been treating agriculture as a social sector. We have been treating agriculture in terms of resilience, drought resilience in particular, then poverty reduction, then we have dealt with food security, and we have done a number of programs to get people just above the water, but we have not treated the sector economically.
Uh-huh.
We have not invested in agro opportunities for industrialization. We are not taking into account scientific developments that can benefit yields per hectare. We are not dealing with distribution circuits that will allow for a better use of intrants like fertilizers and the rest, access to credit, and only now through mobile technology we are seeing some use of technology getting into the agricultural sector, but the examples are still anecdotal.
Uh-huh.
You get one nice experience in Kenya and everybody talks about it, and then a little nice thing in Sierra Leone and everybody talks about it, but in fact in terms of macro impact is not a big deal. And I don't think we are going to be able to really discuss properly industrial transformation of the continent without linking it to agriculture.
Yeah, and of course power and roads, when we come back to that as
of
well.
Course.
I mean, if you don't have roads...
Infrastructure in general, including power.
Yeah, that's right,
power.
Because otherwise food just rots.
Exactly, you cannot have agro-processing if you don't have power.
Yeah.
Even for small, medium scale.
Great. Well, let me open it up for questions. Don't be shy. All you need to tell me is your name, where you come from, if you like, and a short question.